Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. A very big welcome to the first Centenary PPE lecture at Queen's. In a moment, I'm going to introduce the speaker. My name is Claire Craig. I'm the provost here at Queen's, and it's my delightful duty to do the introductions. It was just over 100 years ago that the university established what's now the PPE degree, with this fascinating combination of different but intersecting and important ways of thinking about the world, bringing these three elements together. And of course, graduates from the degree include leaders and influencers around the world. For the next 100 years, the vision is that that degree and those who are taking it will benefit from a sequence of distinguished annual visiting professors. And the position was created by the generosity of old members themselves who valued the degree. And it has this unique format of rotating between the three departments and also two colleges, Queen's and UNIV. Tonight's really exciting for Queen's because this inaugurates for us our first visitor, our first visiting professor. And she is the distinguished political scientist, Christina Davis. She holds the Edwin O. Reischauer Professorship of Japanese Politics at Harvard. The Queen's community is already very much enjoying her having her here with us and delighted to have her as a fellow. Tonight, she's going to speak on the timely, very timely topic of economic diplomacy and the balance of power. After she's spoken, she'd be happy to take questions, and I'm delighted. Please join me in welcoming Christina. Christina.
Thank you all so much for being here tonight. I am very grateful to Provost Dr. Claire Craig and all of the faculty, staff, and students at Queen's College and Oxford University for welcoming me here for a year that is a remarkable opportunity. It is a great honor to serve as the Centenary Visiting Professor of PPE. The tradition of philosophy, politics, and economics degree represents interdisciplinary training and dedication to public service, which is exactly what we need for the complex problems facing us today. And it is my great honor to be serving in this position. Today, I'm going to be talking with you about themes that are very important in my research that I am thinking about as part of a book project that I can work on because I have a year here at Oxford, and I'll be highlighting some research papers that are in progress. The topic of economic diplomacy and balance of power begins with a recognition that trade transforms society. And this can be done through gunboat diplomacy, as when the American Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853 came to Japan and forced the opening of the country to trade with the West after 2 centuries of seclusion. Now, of course, he also came with gifts, promising that trade would bring nice things. He had a full steam locomotive model, a telescope, a telegraph, and various types of wine. But I think that Japan chose to open more because of the gunboats, not because of the promise of wine. And today we have trade opening that is equally transformative. Japan had to change their type of government. They imported entire factories. Engineers were brought over from Europe. They modernized society in order to take advantage of trade and avoid colonization. And even as the way we bring trade to societies is now by negotiation, we still see countries that have to change their laws and society if they are going to take advantage of trade and go forward to engage in the world economy. But of course, the United States now is talking about maybe restricting markets instead of pushing more open markets. When President Trump was first elected, his first day in office in 2017, he marked it by pulling the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, saying that it was a threat to jobs. This gave the opening that same January in 2017 for President Xi Jinping of China to go to the World Economic Forum in Davos and declare that The global economy is the big ocean you cannot escape from. China has learned to swim. President Xi went on to say, China's development is an opportunity for the world. China has not only benefited from economic globalization, but also contributed to it. We're not sure what this January will bring. It may be more of the same. So let us step back and think about how we got here. Populism, of course, the hostility to elites, as well as the multilateral liberal order of globalization. It's widespread. It's not just in the United States. It has its liberal and conservative variants appearing in Europe, Latin America, from Argentina to Brazil. Elsewhere, we also see incumbents, even if they're not populist, losing in elections across the globe. There's a combustible mix of anti-immigrant sentiment, fear about eroding jobs, anxiety over social change that is giving rise to populists. It is so much easier to blame globalization than technology. It may be that now we can make an automobile with less workers, that our steel factories can produce even more steel with less workers. But railing against that technological advance is not as popular as railing against the countries that are trading goods. And so we are seeing the retreat of the United States from leadership in the free trade order. The new coalition in the United States brings nationalism together with economic discontent, labeled as America First, Make America Great Again. Transactions, not entirely against trade, but only when trade benefits America. Anti-trade in the sense that it's exiting agreements, raising tariffs. And yet we can't blame it all on Trump because the Biden administration broadened economic conflict with China, holding up the same tariffs that the Trump administration had imposed, adding more, escalating with subsidies, $52 billion CHIPS Act to subsidize the development of a semiconductor industry strengthening in the United States, and defying the multilateral trading order by continuing to refuse to appoint judges to the trade court, openly defying rulings by the trade court against US policies. And so while we may worry that the return of Trump to the office will escalate the trade war, because he did indeed campaign on a promise that he would raise tariffs on all countries by 10 to 20%, raise tariffs against China by 60%, and this may bring an even greater form of trade war in the years ahead. But certainly there will be others who respond, and his calls for reciprocity may lead to further and further backing away from the free trade order we have come to know. So as we think about this unraveling of the trade consensus, it's important to think what was the underpinning that had brought us to an era of a global economy supported by international economic law in a multilateral trade regime. After World War II, countries came together with the belief that through trade, a community could build consensus and especially strengthen allies so that they would have prosperity. And so the early trade regime focused on a smaller group of like-minded countries who were allies, or smaller neutral countries. And there was a consensus, both a bipartisan consensus at home in the United States and a consensus among these countries, that trade and foreign policy were mutually serving the same goal. And this led to the building of a trade regime, locking in free trade rules, but also norms that supported it. The system seemed strong so that even when we had the Great Recession in 2008, countries came together saying they would not return to the Great Depression of the 30s with tit-for-tat, beggar-thy-neighbor policies. Leader statements, the G7, the G20, countries came together saying they would not retreat from free trade. But the challenge is, of course, that this system has expanded, and China, as the greatest beneficiary, now appears to be a rival. The World Bank heralds that China's economic growth has lifted 800 million people out of poverty, From the time in 1978 when China turned to open world markets, it reformed its own markets, improving economic return. Then in the 1990s, it partnered with foreign multinational companies. And by 2001, joining the multilateral trade regime, it emerged as the leading trade country, the top exporter, the second largest importer. Averaging 9% growth, reducing poverty, we could celebrate. But at the same time, jobs were lost in other countries. And China, in its export-led development, produced trade surpluses as high as 10% of GDP in the height in 2010, and still 2 to 4% of GDP now. These trade surpluses are distorting the global economy and attracting the wrath of populists, both liberal and conservative. And so now we have a clash of an economic power that is also seen as a strategic rival, increasing its defense spending, clashing over what is its appropriate territorial boundaries and its reach in foreign policy. And the clash of economic models, because it is seen that China has not simply grown through fair trade, but rather through state subsidies and state-led capitalism, so that there's fear of this model, and this leads to tit-for-tat protection. If you say that China's subsidies are unfair and illegal, you respond. Then China responds by saying it is facing discrimination, and it raises its own doubling down on subsidies and tariff barriers. Some of this is being mediated in the international trading system. Since joining the trade regime, China has faced 50 complaints against its policies for violations. It's had its day in court to file 28 complaints against other countries. But often, countries are going outside of the rule system, and we are seeing more and more trade barriers. This is an increasing share of world movement towards restricting trade. The World Trade Organization documents that we now see almost 10% of imports in the world facing restrictive measures. This movement is going to slowly roll back free trade, and we need to think about the consequences. Does it also foretell economic conflict? When we think about economic interdependence, is it going to be the source of the commercial peace, that dream that founded the multilateral trade regime, where you can build on mutual interests, share information through the trading community? Or should we instead think of economic interdependence as a vector for conflict, where when you depend on others for things you need, you become vulnerable, you may feel you have to take aggression or cut those ties? We often think in international relations about the security dilemma. The tank I build to defend myself could look threatening to my neighbor, so my neighbor will build tank, and we will have a spiral of more and more defensive measures that contribute to an arms race and less security for everyone. That security dilemma also exists on the economic dimension, as our country builds up its steel and semiconductors, drone technology. That can look threatening to other countries if they fear that you're taking away from their steel industry, semiconductor industry, and are those drones actually aimed at a future war scenario? And so as we see more economic threats, we may also see a dilemma of a subsidy race and increasing spiral towards tensions and distrust. This is especially worrisome, as Farrell and Newman have labeled weaponized interdependence. We now are in a world where we are even more interconnected because of the disaggregation of supply chains. Everything from our semiconductors in our electronics, to the financial network that connects banks together, to the internet that helps us communicate. All of these internet and financial and supply chain connections are vulnerable to disruption. And especially worrisome is when the network that is so vast has a choke point where one provider has a monopoly that could make us all vulnerable to a disruption, whether a deliberate or an accidental disruption. This raises fear. It may lead to retaliation, that any step to disrupt is considered a threat. It could lead to doubling down on national production because the vulnerability is worrisome. And so we have to ask ourselves, like nuclear weapons, will this vast interdependence of the economy lead to mutually assured destruction, where we're so afraid of disruption that we won't use those choke points? Or perversely, is there a risk that no one will quite realize that economic escalation could be dangerous, and they will pull triggers that could lead to escalation? So given this possibility that economic interdependence can both prevent or provoke wars, we need to consider the full implications of economic policy for national security. Now, you hear a lot in the news about the phrase economic security. It's in part because the domestic pressures of populism mean that everything must be justified as serving economic interest. So even foreign policy has to be for the economy. It's also part the international balance, where we have a rising power that is seen as threatening, and China is both an economic superpower and a military superpower. And so that international level tension makes everything securitized. And so we're hearing more and more about economic security. Now, what is economic security? It's the notion that economic policies are deeply connected to national security, whether it's through the fact that our revenue will fund the military, that trade brings the technology ideas that will contribute to drones that might deliver my Amazon package or might deliver information for a weapon that is carefully guided to hit its target. International economic agreements are also tools of diplomacy. So we can go on about the ties that make economic security so relevant. But for the politicians, they need to make the choices. How do you navigate this deep connection between economic policies and national security? Maximizing power to pursue economic wealth, the efficiency of global supply chains. Trade that will give you the power to hold over others, because if they depend on you, you can threaten to suspend that trade. So you might maximize interdependence as profitable, good for leverage. But you might also want to restrict interdependence because it does create vulnerability and you're subject to disruption. So increasingly, we are seeing these trade-offs that are so sharp, and there are strategies. We can think broadly of two ways of balancing. You can balance at home, building yourself up, and you can balance externally through building your connections with others. The rich nation, strong army logic has existed for centuries as governments justify taking more resources for special industries in the name of security, because those industries and that wealth is necessary to keep your country independent. So I studied Japan, and certainly the logic of rich nation, strong army helped mobilize many to say that they should allocate scarce resources in the 19th century towards those industries of steel, shipping, and others. And we can think about mobilizing the economy. Government will intervene, set priorities for where scarce resources should be allocated. Targeting those industries that have dual use, especially something such as steel. I mean, even Adam Smith recognized that protection of the shipping industry was important. And from Britain to Japan, Korea, China, we have all seen shipping receive its share of government wealth. So as we have this domestic balancing to allocate in the pursuit of economic security, we also see the international side of balancing. Now, these are not mutually exclusive. You can allocate resources for building up your economy in the name of security. We can also see diplomacy, where you take your economic policies and use them as a tool in diplomatic leverage, whether rewarding friends or punishing adversaries. This really is an act of directing interdependence. So we take interdependence for granted that it's just a global economy. But of course, there is orchestration, and that is where you decide who you trade with. Last year, I had a book that was published by Princeton University Press on discriminatory clubs that looks at how even multilateral organizations that claim to be non-discriminatory start off as a discriminatory club of like-minded countries. The trade regime, I already said, started off among allies. You know well the European Union was very much bringing allies together. And this pattern is broadly about how sharing the benefits of interdependence should be done most with those you trust and are in shared security relationships with. There's also economic diplomacy through how do you take those scarce technologies that are so important for security and make sure they don't slip across the border to your enemy to be used against you in that potential future war scenario. So a big tool of economic diplomacy is deciding what are those goods that are dual use, both good for commerce and good for military, that should be restricted. And deciding what is strategic can be really difficult. Steel, shipping. What about TikTok? Right now, it's at the top of the list of national security threats for the United States. What makes TikTok so dangerous? Is it the influence over our minds? The tracking of our devices? Well, what next? The latest ban from President Biden is a proposal to have a ban on integrated software parts for cars from China. So that means they don't want software that connects in cars to be from China. All right, so we can think about that. U.S. Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo justified the policy saying that we can see that the Chinese or Russian-made vehicle cameras, microphones, GPS tracking, and other technologies connected to the internet pose a very real threat to U.S. drivers. It doesn't take much imagination to understand how a foreign adversary with access to this information could pose a serious risk. She goes on to state, if the PRC or Russia, for example, could collect data on where the driver lives or what school their kids go to, where their doctor is, that data would make America vulnerable in an extreme situation. A foreign adversary could shut down or take control of all their vehicles operating in the United States, at the same time causing crashes, blocking roads. Are you persuaded? Okay. What about our iPhone? It's connected to the internet. Can Apple still build the iPhone in China if we're worried about interconnection? So where do we draw the line? It's going to be very difficult to decide what products are safe to trade. And who is that adversary? So the US policy throws out China and Russia. Russia doesn't trade that many integrated auto part components, but that just made it sound scary to say China and Russia. But how do we decide our adversary? Because a lot of the movement out of China is to Vietnam. I'm very excited that Vietnam's development is getting a kickstart. It's a communist government. In the past, we had a war. Should we assume Vietnam is our friend? And I do a lot of work in Japan, but Japan and Korea, two advanced industrial democracies, both allies of the United States, engaged in a dispute over dual-use technology and restrictions of semiconductor parts, because Japan for a moment said it couldn't trust Korea. So who's going to decide who we can trust? That's where I want to turn now to talk about governance of economic security. You know, in politics, we always think about who makes the decisions. And often the authority structures are there's high politics, where national leaders must make critical national security decisions. You wouldn't want lobby groups, representational politics to shape nuclear decisions. And low politics, you know, the loan to the Small Business Administration, subsidy to help a firm, an industry, that can be handled by bureaucrats and, yes, their representative constituents. But I've just been telling you that you can't separate so easily. And so now we have this challenge where if you go too far in one direction, security first, you're going to destroy the economy. If every single product we make is dual use and we can't trade it, you will find the economist's lesson in front of you about the loss of income, which at the same time, unleashed free economy might well harm security for the many reasons that we've been talking about. And so the challenge is how to keep this balance. And increasingly, because of the rivalry, where you have the United States and China as economic powers and strategic rivals, and this is spreading throughout the international system, more and more countries are deciding that they need to integrate economic and security policy with greater state intervention in the economy. You're seeing this in the United States. Now, it's not having to create new laws. The US can go back to the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, where Section 232 allows the US to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum, declaring that steel and aluminum were a domestic industry deemed essential for national security. If you recall, when those tariffs went into place in 2018, they were imposed on not just China, but also the UK, Japan, Korea, Canada. And the US also has screening investment by the Committee on Foreign Investment, currently reviewing the bid, $15 billion bid by Nippon Steel to buy US steel, to decide whether Japan is a threat if it owns our steel industry. I was amazed in Senior Common Room reading the Financial Times this week to hear about how the British government is currently trying to persuade the Chinese owner of British Steel not to close a factory. That's right, the Chinese owner of British Steel. Is that a good thing? They brought money into the British steel industry. If they keep that factory open, more jobs. So these are important decisions, and countries are reaching more and more questions of when is it safe. And it's not just the United States. The European Union has imposed investment screening starting in 2020. That actually was a policy that started discussion in 2012. The UK was opposed, so maybe they had to wait till the UK was out, and then they went ahead. And Japan passed an economic security law in 2022, appointing a minister of state for economic security, because if you think about Japan, they are on the front lines of deep interdependence with China, even as they have a strategic area of disputed territory and high concerns about their foreign policy relationship. So Japan is at the forefront of building economic security. This legislation allows them to review domestic supply chains, safeguard infrastructure, promote research in artificial intelligence, quantum technology. The law gives the government the power to order companies to notify them about software updates, to even vet equipment procurement by industries in strategic sectors. Japan is changing how they view defense spending so that it's not just defense spending for defensive weapons, but also investment for civilian research on drones and other topics. So economic security is becoming a new important part of policy making. And often it leads to more state intervention in the economy. So who will hold back this turn? Not the WTO. The World Trade Organization was established as the multilateral regime to support the logic of opening markets slowly. It's never been about free trade. There's always been exceptions. But it was this aspiration that a trading community could avoid war. And by starting small with allies, they were able to slowly liberalize markets and bring tariffs lower. Maybe they got carried away with this promise, letting China in. Now Russia is also a member, and the trade regime has expanded so that it includes all countries. The tools of the trade regime are to stop discrimination, and so this could be used to block coercive diplomacy when too many products have tariffs raised in the name of security but not in the name of security. Because multilateral trade rules can address coercive diplomacy by saying you can't discriminate, and they can tell you, take your dispute to a court in Geneva and make out a legal argument. So if the US and EU 100% tariff on electric vehicles were to be debated, it's discriminatory. Why is an electric vehicle from China different than one from Germany? That's discriminatory. Well, you could say that there's subsidies that are making it unfair, and therefore we are countering those subsidies. So then take it to court and let's document what those subsidies are. Do they follow the rules or not? But if you're saying that you can't depend on electric vehicles because it's a strategic industry, or because you're worried about internet connectivity, or what other reasons are, and you say that this is a measure in the name of international security, the WTO rules give an exception. So read Professor Christoph Pelk's book in detail about how there's a real need for flexibility in international rules because no country would sign a trade agreement that prevented them from suspending the rules in the case of national security. And so from the beginning in 1948, there was a waiver that if a country is in national emergency, it did not have to follow the rules. Now, of course, that leaves a lot of discretion to states. And it relied upon that like-minded consensus that maybe there are some rights we should not exercise. So in the early decades, countries didn't use the loophole for national security. It's only been in recent years that countries are driving through that loophole. And it's the United States saying that we'll protect steel in the name of security, but it's also been other countries increasingly using national security to justify their policies. So the increasing attention to economic security and the decision-making represents a return to national decisions the multilateral system is unable to restrain. And so it matters who's making these decisions. So for political scientists like myself, that prompts us to think about when you're evaluating the balance of how much cooperation and economic gain versus sovereignty cost, my fears of security risk, who's making those trade-offs? We look at institutions and think about how governments are organized to make the right choice. Toss the WTO rules out. This was the US view of economic rulings against its tariffs on steel. But when we think about who's making that choice, it's about a management decision where you're trying to both advance peace and prosperity. The US wanted a strong steel industry for jobs and a strong steel industry for security. But when you're evaluating that, what are the right benchmarks? Trade is cross-cutting. You could say that it's an industrial policy, or you could say that it is a tool of diplomacy. And in order to make the right judgment, you need different types of information. You might want to be highly informed about security threats. You might want to know the full ripple effects on the economy in our complex supply chains. And certainly, an awareness of how, in this complicated network of countries, what are our relationships? What is the red line where a country will be threatened by that tariff measure and respond either with trade retaliation or doubling down on their own development in a way that could undermine our economic and possibly even our security interests? So we need to think about what is the right design and who makes these decisions and what expertise do they bring to play. So in this paper, joint with Yonsu Park and Diana Stanescu, we're trying to look at the management of trade policy, mapping government choices about whether they think trade is fundamentally foreign policy or industrial policy. And so we went through all the WTO trade policy review descriptions of trade policy. This is a summary snapshot, but we looked at 20 years of policy making. And we simplify to say that trade can either be independent, like the USTR or DG Trade, where you say trade is special, and you can go between industrial or diplomacy. Most countries choose to have trade fundamentally commercial policy in the economic policy planning where these are the yellow country, industry lead, where one ministry is both managing subsidies to build up industries and negotiating the trade deals. There's a small number of countries that think that trade should be best handled in the Foreign Affairs Department. So whether Canada, Australia, and there's even some that go back and forth. Korea had its trade policy squarely in industry during its development years, but after the Asian financial crisis thought we need to change gear, bumped it over into the foreign ministry to launch a raft of free trade agreements. Then Park Geun-hye comes into office and says, nope, we're ready to retrench, put it back into the industrial ministry. So there are clear trade-offs that are being made, and I wanted to look at, does it make a difference? Doesn't matter. And so we went and thought, what about the way you negotiate your trade agreements? And looking at preferential trade agreements, we saw that, Foreign Affairs Ministry might conduct trade differently because the national interest, attention to economic statecraft, they will have security linkages that look different. And so looking at the preferential agreements, we look at who are your partners, and what are the security provisions that you put into those agreements? And what we find is that those that have a foreign ministry in charge not only sign agreements with allies, because everyone favors trading with allies, they also reach beyond the close alliance to sign PTAs with non-allies. But they're careful about doing so by adding in security provisions. Either we're going to work hard to cooperate against terrorism. Indeed, the agreement was about building that cooperation. And waivers that if we guessed wrong and you're not really our friend, we always have these exemptions for security. And so we do see a more nuanced approach to writing the agreement, inserting these security provisions when you negotiate with non-allies. In short, it does appear that bureaucratic structure could matter. And so we should be paying attention to these questions. It's especially important when you go from the positive side of economic diplomacy, offering carrots, preferential trade, to the negative side of sticks, the sanctions, where you threaten with your economic tools. Diplomats might be more likely to use trade to expand influence, but what do we think also as we consider the use of sanctions? And how should sanctions be devised? Because increasingly, that's the policy that we're seeing used in economic diplomacy. Economic coercion can be costly to your own economy. It can be costly as a risk of war. Fundamentally, the promise of economic coercion is actually to avoid war. So after World War I, the League of Nations unleashed what was called the economic weapon. The idea that the threat of total economic sanctions, meaning all countries participate and all goods are sanctioned, would be such a horrific threat that it would deter aggression. Of course, no one ever got everyone to comply, and you couldn't impose on all goods because it would be too painful. So we often get partial sanctions that are as much about moral outrage or perhaps a targeted effort to erode the capacity of an enemy. So we shouldn't be so surprised that scholars studying sanctions often say they work to achieve their goal maybe a third of the time. It's hard to analyze, though, because what was the goal and what is the alternative? And it's important that we know that not only is the sanction about limiting economic policy, it also ends up possibly reinforcing authoritarian rule as their response doubles down on authoritarian control of the economy as resources are more and more scarce. We don't need to look far, Cuba, North Korea, Iran, to find regimes that are under strong sanctions, but continue to have some economic activity and a very robust regime survival. So the question of what do we think about sanctions matters because they do have other costs. The cost to labeling a country as an adversary harms diplomacy, may stop future negotiations. It politicizes the trade system in a way that undermines those rules. The risk that it becomes so destabilizing that international economic rules come to mean nothing. So we've seen the possibility that the growing list of sanctions is going to undermine international trade. Russia is, of course, emerging as the top target of sanctions after its invasion in 2022 of all of Ukraine, doubled the number of sanctions imposed against Russia, joining Iran, Syria, North Korea, and Venezuela as those subject to sanctions. But even with Russia invading a sovereign UN member, not all countries participate. And so the challenge is, what do we think about how to make a sanction effective? And we don't want collateral damage. The sanctions of the 1990s against Iraq were said to have killed thousands through malnutrition, and so we've developed smart sanctions. Let's try to be really targeted so that one country could impose a painful sanction, especially against a country like Russia or Iran that trades an oil commodity. And so we see smart sanctions, and I'm going to study them by looking at shipping data. This is a new project, working with Tae-Gyun Lim. We are going to look at how targeted sanctions against shipping, especially focused on oil, are trying to restrict trade. But early evidence is even when you can track closely where these ships go that have been put on a list of sanctioned ships, they don't always stop moving because someone is always willing to receive the ships. Looking at the years 2013 to 2022, and looking at right before and after the sanction is announced, what is the effect on the activity of these ships? We find in aggregate, there's a little downturn in the first months, but 6 months later, those ships have returned to normal activity. So even the smart sanctions have difficulties. And even when targeted with strong agreement against Russia, the sanctions against Russia, again, Russian sanctioned ship entities had some small decline, but then returned to normal activity. So smart sanctions are not going to solve the problem. We cannot stop commerce. There's also the risk that the sanctions are causing more spillover in the entire system, because we know that there are so many sanctions that could be imposed, and we're all trading together, so our goods are subject to vulnerability. So when we look at how does the rest of the world view sanctions, we have to think about these systemic spillovers. And here, in work with Rofan Ma, who's here for a year at Oxford, we're looking at spillover beyond the sanction target, thinking about the trade system getting shaken, confidence in international trade is undermined, so that uncertainty leads states to change their trade flows. But how do they change? They are worried that their global value chains are not reliable. There's risk. They could decide to mitigate that risk through more concentration. Let's trade more with allies, known partners, or reshoring. Let's just trade less and produce at home. So that would lead to more trade concentration. You'd be trading with less countries, or less goods would be traded. But the opposite is you could diversify. I mean, like any investor would say, when face risk, diversify. And you would expand who you trade with because you don't know who will be targeted next in sanctions, and therefore you should expand your trade partners. Well, we test this empirically by looking at how countries that are trading with sanctioned targets diversify their trade partners in subsequent years. The short answer of our early analysis is it does appear they're diversifying, and we see a reduction in the level of trade partner concentration in the years following an increase in trade with sanctioned countries. And it appears that it is not just an evasion, Armenia adding more washing machines that it trades with Russia, but rather broad diversification of partners, and that this is to mitigate against risk. So finally, we have to think about who is caught in the middle. So I'm talking here at an aggregate level about governments. Firms are having to make decisions in this process as well. So how do the firms view the international economy in the day of interdependence and economic security? Now, it might be that we could think that it's just business as usual. Clothing. Why not trade clothes? Leave our stores open. But then, after the pictures from Kharkiv after the Russian invasion emerge, Uniqlo chairman Tadashi Yanai was not quite so confident. He had said clothing is a necessity of life. The people of Russia have the same right to live as we do. After all, sanctions have long accepted food and medicine and not covered that, so why not continue to trade clothing? Well, after a little social media campaign, Uniqlo quickly withdrew and closed their 50 stores in Russia. And Uniqlo was not alone to decide that maybe they shouldn't do business with Russia. Many, many companies withdrew. But I've been trying to highlight economic security is difficult, and business schools do not train them, although actually I think geopolitical tensions is increasingly a topic in business schools today. But maximizing profits does not equip you to think about when should you withdraw from a market. And so to look at this question of how do businesses think about these hard choices, I joined with Sayumi Miyano, Jiaolu Li to run a survey experiment asking businessmen what they think, to try and see what would shift their views towards maybe we should withdraw. And I focused on Japan, because the Japanese government lined up with the US and Europe to impose sanctions. But like the US-Europe, those sanctions did not say all companies must withdraw business. They were targeted. And so businesses had this question, Uniqlo, Toyota, should we withdraw or not? And the question is, what did they factor in when they're making that decision? Peer pressure to follow what other firms are doing? Competition. Are others still doing business? So we do a survey experiment. We had a panel of 2,000 Japanese business managers who responded to our survey just a few months after the May invasion. We varied the information we told them about whether other firms were withdrawing or not, as a way to see how did peer pressure shape their preferences. Baseline is most support withdrawal, but there's room for variation. And we find that when we tell them, we put in prompts to say that US firms are withdrawing. Ford, Motorola. And we add in another prompt to say even more firms are withdrawing from Europe and Japanese firms like Toyota. Then the third information layer was to tell them, oh, there's some Chinese firms that are staying. And we randomized which group received which set of information so that we could parse how the information changed their view about whether Japanese firms should withdraw. The result is hearing that other firms from the US and Europe are withdrawing made them more likely to support withdrawal. It wasn't just from the US prompt. But the reminder about Chinese firms continuing business had a negative effect. They were more reluctant to withdraw. So in short, firms are trying to play geopolitics, watching each other, just like they watch each other for market pricing. Peer conformity encourages them to follow others, but competition is also important as they are being more cautious. And finally, the US is going to have broad cooperation, not just of governments, but how can it get businesses to stand behind the line? I want to conclude here by saying that getting economic diplomacy right is really difficult. You have to think about multiple levels of impact. And to build a global economic order that is resilient to shocks like President Trump, we need to think about what is the open dialogue about the trade-offs we're willing to make for when is it necessary to have national production, which industries. We need to have domestic political institutions that have the right set of information and legitimacy to make those choices of whether we should ban TikTok or not. And certainly, it should not be countries making the decision alone. Somehow we must come together in an international framework that decides what is a reasonable exception for national security that won't pull apart all of the global economy. Government priorities must reflect values and risk. To do so, we need students like the PPE who are trained to think about values of philosophy, who know the bottom line of economics, and are attuned to politics. We can't separate economic security policy. We shouldn't. We also cannot act alone. There has to be a balance of power, but there also must be a broader cooperation. Thank you so much for listening to me. I look forward to your questions.